Thank you so much for joining us. This is the Evidence to Action Symposium, the annual research meeting of the Center for Effective Global Action, which is based at the University of California, Berkeley. My name is Tamina Marden, and I'm the Executive Director for the Center. To introduce and open today's event, I'd like to invite George Breslauer, UC Berkeley's Executive Vice Chancellor and Provost, to deliver some opening remarks. Professor Breslauer is in the Department of Political Sciences, and his research has been very relevant in some sense for today's topic on conflict and post-conflict recovery. So welcome, Vice Chancellor Breslauer.
Well, it's an honor for me to have been asked to make some opening remarks, principally marks of greeting on behalf of the Chancellor and myself. I regret that I cannot stay beyond my opening remarks, but I'm delighted that I was able to come just to say hello. For decades, the U.S. has played a major role in nation building and post-war reconstruction in the world. Some of that is going on now in Iraq and Afghanistan, but the U.S. also intervened in the Arab Spring last year, and last month the U.S. led in the promulgation of a UN resolution holding Sri Lanka to account for war crimes. In Africa, the U.S. has provided substantial support to Uganda and other countries recovering from civil war. So you might say that the road from conflict to recovery features heavily in U.S. foreign policy. The first steps in a country's recovery from conflict are critical, not just for local stability, but for global security. The consequences of a power vacuum can be extreme, ranging from terrorism and military coups to corruption and famine. In part, this motivates today's focus on post-conflict recovery, but there's a humanitarian component to this work as well. Unfortunately, the U.S. does not always succeed in smoothing the transition from civil unrest to stability. It's difficult to know how people will respond to interventions. Should governments take control, or should they invest directly in communities? How can outside actors play a useful role? We need to learn from our past efforts in these regards, while also building a learning agenda to inform future efforts. We don't understand at a micro level how leaders can necessarily mobilize social change after a conflict. How do you build order out of chaos? This is where SIGA researchers are making important contributions. Today, you'll hear from social scientists and policymakers who are testing out different development strategies in the aftermath of war. It's difficult to conduct research in these settings. Collecting data, interviewing people, and asking the right questions, much less staying alive, can be logistically difficult and politically sensitive. But today's speakers, based at Berkeley, UC San Diego, and Stanford, have come up with innovative ways to learn from policies and programs that have been followed in post-conflict settings. We're joined today by several impressive policymakers as well. I would like to welcome Mr. Herbert McLeod, a leader of Sierra Leone's Reconciliation and Transformation, and an advisor to the Office of the President. Thank you, Mr. McLeod, for traveling so far to join us here in Berkeley. I'd also like to welcome Steve Radelet, the Chief Economist at USAID, and Carrie Hessler Radelet, Deputy Director of the Peace Corps. They served as advisors to the Liberian President Ellen Sirleaf Johnson in the aftermath of the Second Civil War there. Finally, I'd like to extend our welcome to retired Colonel Joe Felter, now at Stanford University, who led a counterinsurgency team in Afghanistan, reporting directly to Generals Petraeus and McChrystal. One of the goals this afternoon is to demonstrate how new knowledge gets incorporated into social action. This process requires leadership, both inside and outside the university. It's a complex undertaking, but Berkeley is uniquely positioned in this regard. Our university has a rich history of engagement in important policy dialogues, from the present state of inequality in the United States, to drug reform in Latin America, to the environmental impacts of climate change. As a community and a world-class public institution, we're committed to public service and global engagement. We define public globally. Today's symposium is organized by CIGA, the Center for Effective Global Action. The center was founded by Berkeley faculty 4 years ago, and since then it has grown rapidly under the skilled leadership of Professor Ted Miguel of Berkeley's Department of Economics. I would also like to acknowledge and thank the center's donors, advisors, and partners for their help. Several of you are in the audience today. Your contributions are essential in helping us translate the university's work into positive social impact, and we are grateful for your assistance. Thank you all for being part of this event. Again, my regrets that my schedule does not allow me to stay, but welcome to Berkeley. Thank you.
Very much. So the first thing I want to do this afternoon is tell you a little bit about CIGA. How many of you have been to a CIGA symposium in past? Just raise your hand. Wonderful. Okay, a lot of return customers. That's great. So the Center for Effective Global Action is a research center that stretches across the University of California and Stanford. We are a leading center for research on global social and economic development. And as the Vice Chancellor said, we were established 4 years ago. We've become a real hub on the West Coast and globally for research dissemination, for outreach to policymakers, for this complex process of translating evidence into social impact. We have a network of over 30 faculty researchers, hundreds of PhD students and postdocs working on research projects throughout the world. And I think of note, many of our faculty work very closely with governments, with large nonprofit organizations, and with the private sector to develop some of the research findings you'll hear about today. A thing to note about CIGA and what makes us somewhat distinct in the sphere of research centers is that all of our faculty are committed to using the most rigorous methods in the social sciences, including randomized trials, quasi-experimental techniques, things which are at the cutting edge of economics, political science, and related disciplines. And we use those techniques to isolate and measure the impacts of social programs in developing countries. We have faculty affiliates in various disciplines of economics, working from behavioral economics and labor and development to organizational theory. We're also enriched by a network of non-economists, political scientists, education researchers, public health researchers, even engineers who are steeped in some of these techniques which are at the cutting edge of the social sciences. This is our third symposium. Every year we convene this event to share a little bit of the research we've been doing over the last few years and also explain how we translate this into social impact. So this year's event is going to focus on the road from conflict to recovery in post-conflict nations. But I want to talk a little bit about some of our past symposia and give you an update on where we've come since we first began this event series in 2010. Our first event was a symposium on landmark research on school education done by Ted Miguel, our faculty director, and several other members of the CIGA Research Network. We shared a decade's worth of work on the labor market and educational returns to deworming of school children in Kenya. And at that time, as is shown on this slide, we learned that CIGA researchers had been working with advocates within Kenya's government, with non-governmental agencies, to propel a national program that brought deworming treatments to more than 3 million children in Kenya. So I want to report back on a bit of progress since then. Earlier this year, there was an announcement by Prime Minister Raila Odinga in the Kenyan government of a new 5-year program expanding Kenya's commitment to deworming and treating 5 million children per year who are at risk of parasitic worm infections. Beyond that, word has spread to India, and through work with Deworm the World, which is an NGO that works very closely with SIGA researchers, there has now been major scale-up of deworming in India. In the past year, 17 million children at risk of worm infections were delivered deworming pills in Bihar, another 2 million in Andhra Pradesh. As we speak, there is a scale-up in the city of Delhi to reach more children. And this is an example of how compelling research can change millions of people's lives. Last year's event, Evidence to Action 2011, was highlighting the returns to investment in girls and the role of girls in driving economic development. Since you heard about the research in that symposium, we've had several publications and outreach. One of the more stunning results from that symposium was this finding by Craig McIntosh and others in the SIGA network that providing girls in Malawi with small amounts of cash in hand, just $5 a month, was able to reduce childhood pregnancy, reduce school dropouts, and actually reduce HIV/AIDS by more than 50%. So this was really a remarkable result. It's been very influential. It was published in economic journals, but also in The Lancet, which is a major medical and public health publication. It was done in partnership with the World Bank and is now finding its way into other programs in other countries throughout the world. So today's symposium is going to focus on civil conflict, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the importance on the world's political stage of this topic. We know that political violence is widespread, particularly in developing countries. So while more than half of all countries have had a political civil conflict in the last 40 to 50 years, many of them have been focused in sub-Saharan Africa, in South Asia, and so we'll focus in these areas today. To make the impact of conflict a bit more palpable, I wanted to show a couple of visuals. So this is a world map which shows territory size proportionate to land mass. This is from worldmapper.org. How many of you have played with this tool or are familiar with it? Just raise your hand. Okay, so a couple of people. This provides data and scales it on a map so that you can see here the map showing territory scaled to population size. So this demonstrates the intense density of population in South Asia and India and China, less population density in sub-Saharan Africa and in Latin America. Now what happens when we scale the map to GDP? You see massive wealth in the northern countries, in Japan. Now we're going to scale it to war battle deaths. And you see the disproportionate impact of conflict in sub-Saharan Africa, in parts of South Asia, in parts of Southeast Asia. So clearly, civil war, civil conflict, and poverty go hand in hand. This is an image or a graph which shows on the horizontal axis the level of GDP per capita for different countries. It's showing percentiles, which means at the very bottom or at the very far left at 0 are the poorest countries, and at 1 are the wealthiest countries. And on the vertical axis, we have the incidence of civil war, so the exposure of these countries to civil war. And here you clearly see that countries which are poorer are much more exposed to civil war than countries on the wealthy end. There's a 5 times difference between these two red bars. So what SIGA researchers have been focused on is identifying some of the causes or problems that drive civil conflict in poor countries, and we're trying to identify public policies that can help address conflict. An obvious one is international peacekeeping initiatives, so efforts to either deploy peacekeeping troops to conflict-riddled areas or to enforce brokered peace agreements. But for countries that are hoping to escape from conflict and rebuild, it's extremely important to avoid further conflict. And a couple of the tools that academics and others are starting to experiment with are investing in economic opportunities for people who are coming out of conflict, and also changing political institutions and culture to reduce the risk of violence. We're going to hear about each of these today in different contexts and different settings, but you're going to hear about programs in Iraq and Afghanistan that are trying to create economic opportunities, for example, public works jobs for men that will reduce their participation in violence. We're going to learn how these programs were implemented, what impacts they had on violence. We're also going to hear about a couple of programs that seek to change political institutions or culture within countries that have been affected by violence. Things like reconciliation and reintegration programs. We'll hear about research in Sierra Leone, as well as programs in Liberia and elsewhere. So there are a couple of reasons that this kind of research is very difficult, and our Vice Chancellor George Breslauer alluded to this earlier. There are a couple of problems in particular that make this research a challenge. Obviously, it's very difficult to generate new data in conflict settings. It's dangerous, so just being in these conflict settings puts researchers at risk. But there are other more subtle difficulties as well. Things like getting responses, honest responses from people, and getting responses which reflect not the impacts of the war they've just lived through, but their pre-existing conceptions or feelings about war. It can be very difficult to get a true measure of people's intrinsic beliefs about war. Another problem is that the official statistics recorded by public agencies tend to ignore important issues related to conflict, and particularly gender-based violence. While women are not always the cause or participants in civil conflict, they often bear a heavy load of the consequences. And so we'll hear from a researcher today who will talk particularly about some of the consequences of civil conflict and capturing some of those data that get ignored by statistical agencies. And of course, there's also a methods problem, which is establishing causality. I've shown you a couple of images that demonstrate that nexus or linkage between poverty and civil conflict, civil war. They clearly go together. But figuring out the cause and effect is very difficult, and we need to know the causal linkages in order to understand how to intervene, how to develop policies that will take us in the right direction. So with this methodological challenge, we bring a lot of new techniques and novel statistical tools to start untangling the directions of causality. We also are taking advantage of natural experiments. I want to close with a personal story, and I think a lot of us have these experiences. Our grandparents, our parents, even some of us who have immigrated from other countries have been exposed to violence, have been part of civil conflict and the recovery from civil conflict. My own grandfather was living in Burma, he's Indian, and escaped on foot through the Burmese jungles into India during the Second World War. I think many of us have stories of very difficult transitions that our families have lived through. My grandfather recently wrote some of his stories from that era in a book, and I showed it to a friend of mine who grew up in Sri Lanka. And he, of course, was part of the civil conflict throughout the 1980s and the 1990s. And he said, I read this book. It was set in the 1930s, the 1940s, and I thought, my God, my experience was exactly the same. Things don't change. And I think I'm particularly excited about some of the stories we'll hear today because we are starting to learn about conflict. Conflict has been with us forever. It continues to have a high economic and social cost. But I think what's unique about some of the people you'll hear from today is that they're trying to tease apart the causes of conflict, the potential interventions that can prevent conflict, and interventions that can accelerate the process of recovery. So with that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Pascaline Dupas. She's a professor at Stanford University, and she's going to present on some of the economic and social consequences of post-election violence in Kenya in 2007-2008. Welcome, Pascaline.